In this lesson, we'll discuss defining mandatory and optional parameters. The topics include: what are parameters? Why would you want to use parameters? How do you define parameters? What if a parameter may or may not be needed? And how do you know if a parameter is mandatory or optional? Moving over to our first code example, as you can see, we've got a function called addressTable with 4 parameters. The parameters are $name, $addressLine1, $addressLine2, and $addressLine3. On lines 7 through 12, we define an HTML table which identifies a name and up to 3 lines of address. This is put into a variable, and we are using the concatenate equals operator to combine the information started on line 7 with the information produced by the sprintf statement, where we have one placeholder, %s, which is replaced by the variable $name, $addressLine1, line 2, and line 3, which are coming in as parameters. This variable is then returned as the return value for the function. On line 17, we are going to execute the addressTable function and echo the return value, supplying 4 parameters. On line 20, however, you'll notice that there are only 3 parameters supplied, which will then return a notice. Let's go ahead and move over to the browser and have a look at the return result. So you can see here we have a notice undefined variable. We also have a warning which tells us that there's a missing argument for addressTable. Although PHP does allow execution, the warnings and the notices tell us that something else needs to be done. The solution is to define the missing parameter as optional. Moving over to the second code example, you can see the way that's done is by simply assigning a default value. So in this case, $name, $addressLine1, and $addressLine2 are mandatory parameters in that if there's no value supplied, PHP will generate a warning and a notice. The fourth parameter, $addressLine3, is optional in that it is assigned a default value. So if no value is assigned for addressLine3, the default will become an HTML non-break space, which is ampersand NBSP semicolon. Otherwise, the code is the same as the previous example. Looking now at line 17, we have 4 parameters. On line 19, this will now work okay with default. So let's save this, move over to the browser, move over to the second code example. You can see we have 2 HTML tables representing name and address, where the third line of the address is now optional. In review, what are parameters? Parameters are variable names that you make up when defining the function. They are listed in order in parentheses following the name of the function. Why would you want to use parameters? Parameters are used to insert values into the function so that it can be called many times using different values. How do you define parameters? Parameters are defined by listing variables inside the parentheses when you define the function. What if a parameter may or may not be needed? The parameter that may or may not be needed is referred to as optional. In your function definition, inside the parentheses, you simply assign a default value, which will then make this particular parameter optional. How do you know if a parameter is mandatory or optional? Mandatory parameters do not have a default value. This concludes our discussion of defining mandatory and optional parameters.